Chapter 12. Long before they reached Lukasek, Luke Skywalker settled on Mudsloth as the name for Akana's previously unnamed Verpine adventurer. He realized he had been spoiled by years in high-performance military spacecraft, operating under wartime conditions or a military waiver. But realizing that didn't make it any easier to adjust to civilian navigation restrictions. Not only was Mudsloth a dawdler in real space, but its hyperspace motivator simply refused to enter or leave hyperspace within a planetary flight control zone. Luke didn't object in principle to FCZ regulations. They helped ensure that less experienced pilots in less capable ships made slow approaches to populated worlds and busy space lanes. But he had never been subjected to a 4-day real space crawl just to leave Coruscant. He was accustomed to reaching for the hyperdrive moments after his ship cleared the atmosphere. Mudsloth insisted on waiting until it had cleared the star system. But there was nothing to be done about it. The adventurer wouldn't accept his military waiver, and didn't even have a system configuration option on its cockpit displays. It was designed to prevent such meddling. Driven by impatience, Luke briefly considered powering down the hyperdrive and opening up the surface access to see what he could do with it. But he soon talked himself out of it, realizing that reprogramming a motivator was beyond his talents as a tinkerer. Even a starship as simple as the Adventurer was far more complex than the Incom T-16s and land speeders he'd spent so many days hopping and rebuilding back on Tatooine. Now, when it came to hyperspace, it was too easy for a small oversight to become a final fatal error. Anyone who'd flown for long had heard the stories and respected the danger. Of all the risks inherent in traveling unimaginable distances at incalculable speeds, the one that entered most pilots' nightmares was the one-way jump, never coming out of hyperspace. Even Han and Chewie left the exacting business of rebalancing a motivator to professionals, and never begrudged them their hefty fees. But that had left Luke trapped in cramped quarters with Akana for just over 11 days on the way to Lukasek, something he had not been prepared for. After months in isolation, he had not been prepared for that much close contact with anyone. Luke wondered how he would have borne it if Akana had not been so willing to make allowances. She did not force conversation on him, either idle or earnest. Nor did she make him feel as though he was being watched, that she was waiting for him to do something. Without his ever asking, she granted him the only kind of privacy available under the circumstances, the privacy of the mind and heart. She did not intrude there without his invitation, hiding her own needs and curiosity so perfectly that they seemed more like comfortable old friends than strangers. At her suggestion, they adopted a watch schedule that had them sleeping at opposite ends of the day, spaced so that neither of them had to climb into a hot bunk. She seemed to welcome the reassurance that someone was awake while she rested, and did not seem to mind that the schedule reduced their time together to a few hours twice a day. Luke thought Akana must be accustomed to being alone, for she seemed to have mastered the art of keeping time moving without restless motion. She read from a battered old data pad, meditated in the co-pilot's couch, and intently studied the adventurer's owner, pilot, and system helps. At times, she even sought privacy for herself. Akana practiced her Falanasi craft in silence behind the drawn curtain of the sleeper, and stripped to a body-hugging monoskin to exercise only when it was Luke's turn in the zippered bunk bag. She even politely ignored him when he made both discoveries, making it unnecessary for him to apologize or for her to explain. They did take meals together, dipping twice a day into Akana's modest cache of stabilized food stores, many of them long-expired Imperial Expedition packs, a telltale sign of desperately tight finances. But even meals did not become an occasion for substantive conversation until near the end, with Lukasek visible through the viewport, and the reason for their journey too much in their thoughts to be ignored. 16 more hours, Luke said, tearing open a pouch of Noryath brown meat bread. I hate the waiting. I want to crawl back in the bunk and sleep until the autopilot starts asking whether we want to orbit or land. If I thought this was the end of our journey, rather than just the end of the beginning, I might feel the same way, said Akana, and sipped at her flask of tart Poway juice. Do you think there's any chance the Falanasi may have come back after the war? No, said Akana. You see, the Empire feared us as well as coveted our power. They didn't come down with weapons drawn to round us up, as they did with so many other populations they enslaved. Yeah, I've seen how they work. But how did they even know you existed? I thought you were a secret sect. Or am I the only one who never heard of the Falanasi? You are right. There is a contradiction, said Akana. The explanation is simple, but an embarrassment. We were divided among ourselves about the coming war and what our moral duty was. One of our community, for reasons of her own, went to the imperial governor and revealed herself. You were betrayed? No, that's too strong a word. Even though her name is no longer spoken, she had a high purpose in what she did. She believed that by allying ourselves with the Empire, we could be the water that would quench the flame. Akana's eyes were touched by wistfulness, but she was wrong. It was too late for that. The fire was already beyond control. Well, I don't know why you called it an embarrassment, said Luke. The only communities that think with one mind are those that only have one mind, and I haven't met anyone yet who hasn't ever been passionately wrong about something, sometime. You are generous, said Akana. More generous than the circle was able to be. It's easier for me, he said. I wasn't the one betrayed. She acknowledged him with a nod. The Empire sent General Tag to Wialu, who held the wand of privilege then, to offer us the protection of the Emperor. He said it was important for us to show our loyalty, that was the only way we could escape the fate of the Jedi. We knew what that meant. The Jedi were being hunted down as traitors and sorcerers, and no one dared openly favor or befriend them. Forgive me, I don't mean to sound suspicious, but how do you know all this? Luke asked. You said you were just a child, and off-planet at the time. No, I was still on Lucasek when General Tag came there, said Akana. My mother, her name was Isala, was one of the women who met with Wialu in Circle afterward to decide what to do. And children are not protected from adult concerns in our community, as they are in so many places. Isala told me of the Empire's invitation and what it might mean to refuse it. I guess I don't understand then, said Luke, trying to remember where he had heard the general's name before. How did you become separated from the others? I assume the Falanasi left Lucasek rather than either refuse or accept. No, that was months later, explained Akana. Wialu did refuse General Tag. She told him that the loyalty of the Falanasi was to the light, and that we would not let ourselves be used to further the ambition of generals, kings, or emperors. Tag. I remember now, said Luke. He was on the first Death Star when Leia was a prisoner. He paused, then added, he was probably still on board when my proton torpedo blew it to bits. Luke didn't know what possessed him to make that claim before Akana, and her response made him feel even more foolish for having done so. She stiffened as he spoke, and he could feel her withdrawing from him, though she barely moved. Do you seek honor from me for this? In time you will understand that the Falanasi honor no heroes for killing, not even killing one who has been our tormentor, said Akana. I'm sorry, Luke said, and wondered at his own words. Everything suddenly seemed upside down. It was strange and unsettling that the deed for which he had been so lionized now became touched with regret. regret over the killing of an enemy who had been his own sister's tormentor. That moment had decided both his future and the galaxy's, and he had never, in all the years since, questioned the rightness of what he had done. Akana nodded, and her face seemed to soften. "I will not speak of it again." Luke was happy to leave behind his ill-considered words, and the jumbled thoughts and alarming feelings that had followed them. "How did the Empire respond to Wialu?" he asked. "Is that when you left Lukaszak?" "No, not until later," said Akana. "Tag tried to force us to come to him by destroying our relationship with our neighbors. Lukaszak was an open immigration world then, and tolerant, or so we thought. We shopped in villages nearest to ours and hired workers from them. Tag placed agents in those villages to kill house animals and set fires and turn the waters bitter and make other strange things happen." "And then blame the Falanasi," Luke guessed. "Yes, the Empire's agents whispered against us until those who'd been our friends feared us. The workers stopped coming to our village, and 3 of our circle were attacked when they went to Jisasu for food and to sell our medicines. That was when my mother sent me away, not to protect me, because she and the others could protect the children well enough, but she didn't want to expose me to the hate that surrounded us then. I was one of 5 who were sent away, to friends on Peg, to schools on Tyr or Karatas." "How many of you went to Karatas?" "Only me," Akana said. She smiled sadly, her eyes bright with tears. "They were to send for us when Lukaszak was peaceful again, or come for us when they headed for a new home." "But they never did?" "No, I never heard from any of the body again." She shook her head. "I don't know why." "And you still don't know what happened?" "All I was ever able to learn is that they left Lukaszak, that our village was abandoned and in ruins. I couldn't even find the other children on Tyr and Peg. I think the circle came for them. I think I was the only one left behind." She tried to say it matter-of-factly, but the hurt still showed. "Or maybe you're the only one the Empire didn't find. Have you considered that?" "I have tried not to think about that," Akana said, looking past him to the pale brown disk of Lukaszak. "I would rather be the only one left behind than the only one left alive." The region of Lukaszak that Akana called the North Plateau had no true spaceport. Luke was directed to set the mud sloth down at a quiet little airfield identified only by its latitude and longitude. There he and Akana were met by 3 men wearing drab brown clothing, so similar one to the next that it might as well have been a uniform. They identified themselves as the airfield marshal, the district censor, and the port magistrate. The censor had a small recorder, into which he both spoke and repeated their answers.
"Point of origin?"
"Coruscant," said Luke.
"Registry of your vessel?"
"Karatas," Akana supplied.
"Do you affirm that you are both citizens of the New Republic?"
"We are," said Luke.
"Purpose of your visit?"
"Research," said Akana. "Archaeological research."
"No digging is permitted without a license from the Proctor of History,"
the magistrate warned them.
"All artifacts must be submitted to the office of the Proctor so that the appropriate taxes can be determined. Evasion of antiquities taxes is a state crime punishable by—"
Luke made a small gesture, slicing the air with his fingertips. "We are aware of the regulations, Magistrate."
"What?" "Yes, of course,"
the magistrate said, and lapsed into silence. Luke turned to the shortest of the 3 men. "Marshal, I would like to arrange for my ship to be hangared. I wouldn't want any curious children to accidentally injure themselves."
"I'm afraid there are no—"
"I'm prepared to pay the reasonable and customary fees, of course."
How long do you think you'll be on Lucasec?
I couldn't say, Luke said. Is that a problem?
No. I believe some space recently became available in Hangar Ka, our newest and most secure. I'll have your ship towed in. A Verpine Adventurer, isn't it? I hear that's a fine vessel. I don't think we've ever had one of those in here before.
Thank you, Luke said. His gaze settled on the sensor. Was there anything else?
I must see your identity cards, of course,
the sensor said, puffing up his chest. We've already shown them to you, Luke said, intensifying his focus on the man.
Of course,
said the sensor, his eyes suddenly blank.
Your destination was...
Jisasu, said Akana.
Yes, of course. You'll want to hire a cart. Go by the East District Trail. The bridge at Crown Pass Road has been out since the last rain, and the river can't be forded on account of the debris.
Luke nodded. Very kind of you, he said, smiling pleasantly. I'll be sure to mention your helpfulness in my report. He hoisted both their bags and slung them over one shoulder. Come, Lady Anna. I'd like to see if we can't get there before dark.
Lady Anna?
Akana said when they enjoyed the privacy of the road, jolting along in one of the big-wheeled, two-seated utility vehicles common on Lucasec.
I like that. And what shall I call you? The Duke of Sky?
I'd prefer not to give any name at all, said Luke. I'd rather anyone we meet not quite be able to recall my face or remember my name, as though they were too distracted by you to pay attention.
I'd like that too,
she said with a smile. There had been a few structures near the airfield that might have been houses, but East District Trail had quickly turned into a road through a brown and hilly nowhere. Is anything familiar yet? Do you know this part of the district?
It's all familiar, after a fashion. I knew Crown Pass Road better. That was the short way to Jisasu, and Big Hill, but I hardly recognized the airfield. It's so built up now.
Luke shot her a surprised look. Built up?
Oh, yes. When I left here, the airfield was nothing more than a flat spot everyone had agreed not to farm or fence, and a few marks on the ground to guide the pilots in. There weren't any hangars, because there weren't any flyers kept there.
Or perhaps the other way around, said Luke. I'm glad we didn't need a docking bay on this stop. We would have had to put down 500 kilometers from here.
Yes, at the towers. It's a long trip. But then I remember this being a long trip. And look, there's the river ahead. You can mark it by the trees. See beyond, where it gets more hilly? That's Hastings Watershed. The haze is from cook fires. There are villages all through the Hastings. Anywhere there's a permanent supply of water.
Any impressions of our welcoming committee?
Cold, said Akana. No one ever carried or asked for an identity card back then. People didn't automatically look at you with suspicion.
They were bureaucrats, Luke reminded her.
There weren't any officials in charge of suspicion back then.
Well, this was occupied territory. Strike even a friendly animal often enough. Whoops, hang on! The cart pitched sharply down and jerked to a stop as the front wheel dropped into a deep rut. Both Luke and Akana were thrown forward, nearly catapulted from their seats. Akana grabbed for the sideboard and seat back, while Luke clutched the steering arm in one hand and braced himself with a foot against the splashboards. For a long moment the constant-speed motors driving the rear wheels whined in complaint until the front wheel popped free of the rut and the cart lurched forward.
Oh, something else, said Akana. The roads are a lot smoother now.
You're kidding.
No, we used to have to hang on with both hands the whole way to Jisasu.
She smiled to herself at the memory.
The kids made a game of it, standing up in the cargo box, holding on to the back of the seats, or not, trying to keep from falling down or falling out. I did both.
Just then a rock under the left wheel sent a hard jolt up both Luke's and Akana's spines.
But that was a long time ago. I suppose a little levitation is out of the question.
Are you asking or offering?
Either. Both.
Another cart appeared over the rise ahead of them, coming toward them. "I think we'd better keep the wheels on the ground," Luke said. "It's a little late to start disguising us as a whirl dust." Akana nodded, raising her cupped hands in greeting to the wiry old farmer and clean-faced young woman in the approaching cart.
"And I still think concealing ourselves would be a mistake," she said. "We may still have to talk to the neighbors to find out what we need to."
She paused as the other cart passed by at close range, neither occupant answering her greeting or offering more than a quick, stony-eyed, sidewise glance.
"If anyone will talk to us, that is."
They missed the turnoff for Ealtra, because it no longer existed. The common market that had stood at the intersection of Crown Pass Road and the Ealtra Trail was gone, its location marked only by the stump of its center post. And there was no longer a road to the village of the Falanasi, not even by the modest standards of Lukaszek, which Luke had decided required only a 3-rut path from which the largest rocks had been removed. The old ruts could still be seen, but it seemed as though the trail had been deliberately strewn with large rocks, especially where it had once joined the main road. "Are you sure this is the right place?"
"Yes," Akana said. "Completely sure."
"I've got a bad feeling about this," Luke said, shaking his head.
"So do I, Luke,"
she said timorously, reaching for his hand.
"So do I."
In its heyday, Ealtra had had more than 30 buildings, and all but a few had transcended the simple, pragmatic architecture of the region. The Circle House had stood 3 stories high, with a great open archway that divided the lower floors in half, and tiled facings in complex, abstract designs. Its rooftop gardens, fed by pipe and solar pump, offered not only lush grass and flowers in profusion, but a view over the surrounding hills. Medicinals and food crops once grew under 3 translucent domes nested between pairs of small workhouses. Ring dwellings had been scattered everywhere, each with half a dozen wedge-roofed sleeping cottages surrounding the common rooms. Ealtra had enjoyed 2 wells and a walled pond, and a long, wandering meditation trail with more than a dozen hillside shelters. One slope facing north had been carved away into an open-air amphitheater, large enough to seat the entire community, with a focus that could accommodate either a performing stage or a ceremonial fire. None of it remained untouched, and it was clear to both Luke and Akana that weather and time alone had not done the damage. The Circle House had been collapsed into rubble, its supporting walls knocked out from under it. The growing domes had been exploded from within. Fragments of the clear, crystalline material littered the ground everywhere, crunching underfoot as the visitors walked slowly among the ruins. The amphitheater was buried under a landslide. The walled pond had been breached and now was bone dry. The large well had been filled and heaped over with masonry from a wrecked ring dwelling. The small well appeared to have been poisoned with whatever solvents and reagents could be found. A small mound of empty, dust-covered containers of assorted shapes and sizes standing nearby gave testimony to that. A few of the ring dwellings stood nearly intact, but even those had been defaced. Their tiled facings had been smashed, and a symbol, 2 lines slashed across the circle, had been crudely burned onto the walls with blaster fire. Akana stood by one of these, biting her lower lip, saying nothing. Anguish and sadness radiated from her with such intensity that Luke found it necessary to shield himself from most of it.
"This was our home,"
Akana said at last.
"Isela and I lived here. Toma and Jai and Norika next to us on this side. Nori was my best friend."
Closing her eyes, she bowed her head for a moment, as though steeling herself. Then she ducked through an entry arch, walking across the door that had once sealed it. The door had had no lock, but its hinges were blaster-scorched and melted all the same. Luke waited outside, granting Arkana privacy in the ruins of her memories. She rejoined him a few minutes later, standing taller and seeming stronger.
"They weren't here when this happened," she said. "Whether they were taken or escaped, none of them died here."
"Why do you say that?"
"Because of the way it feels here," Arkana said. "I don't know quite how to describe it, except that I'm sure that I'd be able to feel it if even one of us had been killed here. This was an empty gesture. It didn't touch the current."
"It feels that way to me too," Luke said, "and I'd vote for escaped. I've been thinking as I look around that this was all done out of frustration. They desecrated your home because that was all they could do. Something else. They didn't use anything bigger than a personal blaster for this, nothing military grade. This isn't the Empire's work."
"Our friends in Big Hill and Jisasu,"
Arkana said stiffly. "They were lied to," said Luke. "None of us are immune to fear."
"Please don't try to stop me from being angry at them," Arkana said. "We do not pretend to emotional purity. This was my home. I have the right."
"Of course," Luke said. "Arkana, which was my mother's house?" Arkana closed her eyes and thought for a moment.
"Arid,"
she said, opening her eyes and pointing across the compound.
"Number 4.
She smiled faintly.
"I understand. Go on, I'm all right."
Nodding his appreciation, Luke turned and started across the open ground toward the ruined ring dwelling at the foot of the highest of the enclosing hills. But he was not even halfway there when a scream froze him. He whirled, his cape sweeping outward, and a blaster bolt burned past him so close that he could smell the heat. He rolled away from the heat, came out of the roll with a forward flip that carried him 5 meters away from where he had stood, and ended the flip searching for his attacker, his lightsaber in his right hand. There were 2 men near Arkana, who was huddled on her knees with an arm raised as though she had just fended off a blow. "Arkana!" he cried, and charged toward them. The next blaster bolt was dead on target, but Luke deflected it neatly skyward with his lightsaber. In the next moment he drew deeply on the Force, and reached out to crush the blaster with a thought as powerful as a vice. His next thought yanked the disabled weapon from the man's hand and hurled it far out of reach. Arkana had raised her head when he called her name.
"No, Luke, don't!"
she cried, but Luke's focus was the second man, who was now showing a weapon too, pointed at Arkana. "Keep your distance," the man shouted at Luke. He did not sound afraid. Luke's answer was a thought blow that tore the blaster from the man's hand and smashed it against the wall of the dwelling behind him. It exploded into a shower of sparks and shattered into a dozen fragments. Then he was on them, the lightsaber held for attack, not defense. The first man he had disarmed projected a personal shield, which blunted Luke's initial stroke. But the blow took the man to his knees all the same. The next stroke, with the power of the lightsaber married to the will of a Jedi Master, sliced through the shield and deep into the assailant's chest. He gasped once as blood erupted, then crumpled backward onto the hard ground. Turning quickly, Luke found the second man closing on Arkana again, reaching for her as though meaning to use her as his shield. Instantly, Luke threw his lightsaber, spinning the weapon end over end with a sharp snap of his wrist. It scythed through the air, severing the attacker's left arm above the elbow. The man screamed and collapsed as Luke brought the lightsaber back to his hand. "Who are you?" Luke demanded, standing over the fallen attacker. The stump of his arm scarcely bled.
"Commander Puffin reporting. Skywalker?"
the man said. Then he closed his eyes, and his entire body shuddered. A moment later his eyes flew open again.
"Skywalker is here."
With a flick of the tip of his lightsaber, Luke disabled the comlink on the man's equipment belt. "Who are you?" he demanded again. "Why are you here?"
"Not fair. Waited so long,"
the man said and moaned.
"We only expected the witch."
"Why were you waiting? What did you want?" The man grimaced.
"They said the poison wouldn't hurt,"
the man whispered, and died, still staring at the sky. Wearing a mask of worry, Luke crouched beside Arkana, who was still huddled on the ground, shaking from head to toe and sobbing.
"Akana, are you hurt?" he asked, touching her arm. Recoiling violently from his touch, she turned away from him. "I'm sorry. I must have been distracted," he said, shifting to where he could see her face. "I should have known they were here. But it's over. They can't hurt you now." Still trembling, Akana turned away from him again. "They never could have hurt me." "What are you talking about? You screamed. You were on the ground." "I wasn't hurt. I wasn't in danger. There was no reason for what you did." "What I did?" With a will, she gathered her feet under her and staggered away from him, hugging herself fiercely. He followed, dimly beginning to grasp that the depth of her distress came from the second assault, not the first. His acts, not the acts of the dead men. "I thought you were in trouble," he said. "Couldn't you have protected us without harming them?" she demanded, whirling to face him. "They startled me, nothing more." Luke extended his awareness, searching the ruins, the hills. "We'll have to talk about this later," he said. "These were Imperial agents. There's no telling how close or how far away their friends are. We have to leave. We have to get back to the ship, now." No, not yet." "Akana, no matter what you think, we can be harmed." "Is the river harmed by the rock a child throws?" "We don't have time to debate this now," Luke said impatiently. "The mud sloth may not be much, but I don't want to lose her. This planet isn't what I had in mind for my retirement, and I'd rather not have to play hide-and-seek with an Imperial gunship to get out of here." "Where do you suggest we go?" Akana asked. "It doesn't matter. Away from Lukaszak as fast as we can. We're not going to find the Falinasi here. The only explanation for all this that makes sense is that your people escaped both the Empire and the mob. The Empire doesn't know where they are, and we don't want to be the ones who show them. It's time to go." Akana shook her head slowly. "There's something I have to show you first," she said. "Come." Backing away, she led him through the arch into what had once been her home. Light streamed in through the windows and broken roof of the common room, but the sleeping cottages were cool and dim beyond the light trap. "This was my mother's space," Akana said. "There. Can you see it?" Her sweeping gesture took in the full width of the back wall. "See what?" "Listen for the sound," she said. "Like water slipping through sand. Drop all your shields." Luke tried to concentrate on the wall, but confusion was the enemy of concentration. "What is it? Is there something written there? Am I supposed to see it or hear it?" "Yes," she said, her one answer covering all his questions. "You're a lot of help," he said, squinting. "Let go of the Force," she said. "It can't help you in this. You've trained yourself to see the shadows. Let yourself see the light." Drawing a deep breath, Luke tried to focus on the wall, to open his awareness to every aspect of its existence as a material object traveling through time. Every immanent quality perceivable on any plane. Color and texture, mass and temperature, the feeble tug of gravity, the faint glow of radiation, its solidity deflecting the currents of air, its opacity blocking the light, its contribution to the scent and flavor of the air, and 100 more subtle measures that defined its reality. "Let me help," she said, taking his hand. "Do you perceive the wall?" "Yes." "Take it away. Stop perceiving the substance. Make it disappear from your thoughts and look inside it. Stay open. Let me guide your eyes." Then he saw it. Not written on the wall, but written within it. The pale white shapes of symbols drawn not with matter, but with some elemental essence swirling within it. "Is that it?" he asked, as though she could not only guide his eyes, but see through them. She smiled, and tightened her grip on his hand. "The way home is always marked. That is the promise made to us." "Can you read it? What does it say?" "I know where we have to go," Akana said, and released his hand. "Can you still see it now, without my help?" The symbols had been brightening, but they vanished abruptly when the contact was broken. "No, it's completely gone. I can remember the shapes, but I can't see them now." Nodding, she said, It doesn't matter. If you can see current scribing with guidance, I can teach you to see it on your own. It's how children learn.
Is there more? In the other cottages, or outside on the other buildings?
No, just here. This was meant for me.
The attack. It came after you'd been in the house, Luke said with sudden understanding. They knew there was something there. That's why the Empire still had agents here. They were just waiting for someone who could read it to show up.
But would the Empire risk sending a ship this deep into New Republic territory?
That depends on how badly someone still wants the Falanasi, Luke said. I don't think we should wait around to see.
Akana frowned. No.
And we can't be followed.
No, she agreed. Can you cloak us?
I can disguise our appearance, but we have to do more than that, Luke said. You need to erase the message. Even without looking at her, he felt her reluctance and resistance. It's the only way to be sure this trap has been disarmed, he added. Can you erase it? Can it be done at all?
Scribing opens a tiny breach between the real and the unreal,
Akana said with a slow nod.
It's easier to collapse it than create it.
She hesitated, then sighed.
Wait for me outside.
She did not keep him waiting long.
It's done,
she said, taking his arm as she joined him.
But just to be certain no one can undo it, please knock it down.
Are you sure?
Please, she said. I'm never coming back here. Bring all of it down.
Without moving from where they stood, Luke complied. A twist of a corner, a push in the middle of a long wall, opened a spider web of cracks. The cracks widened in turn until the stonework fell in and the roof collapsed atop it, kicking up a billow of yellow dust. "We'd better hurry now," Luke said.
"There's one more thing," she said. "You need to go inside your mother's cottage."
He shook his head sadly. "There isn't time."
"Take the time," she said. "I'll hide us so you can stay open while you're there."
"Akana,
a few minutes won't matter to the outcome," she said. "The nearest friend of the men you killed is either very close already or a very long way away, but those few minutes may matter a great deal to you. Go."
Luke sat in the middle of what had been the floor of the ruined cottage and whispered his mother's name, as if to ask the broken stones whether they remembered it.
"Nashira," he said.
But the sound fled into the dark corners and vanished. "Nashira," he called, but the echoes escaped out through the cracks and fissures in the walls. He brushed the litter aside and pressed the palms of his hands to the floor, drew the dusty air deep into his nostrils and tasted it on his tongue, slowly scanned all around him for anything that might have belonged to the last person to make a home of that space.
"Mother,"
he said, and the reality of the moment welled up inside him. It was a point of contact. After so many years without one, she had been where he was now. It did not matter that he could not find her touch lingering on the rude substance surrounding him. The knowledge alone was enough. Where before he could only pretend, now he could imagine, and imagination overleaped the time that separated them. She had slept here, laughed here, retreated here for sanctuary, cried and sought peace here, perhaps loved and grieved here. Moving through this space as real as life and as human as the rush of longing Luke felt in that moment. He could not see her face or hear her voice, but even so, she was more real to him in that moment than she had ever been before. It was not enough, not by half, but it was a beginning. The village was in shadow by the time Luke emerged from Nashira's cottage and rejoined Akana. The sun had dropped below the hills, and the breeze had a softer edge.
"How long was I in there?" "It doesn't matter," she said. "Are you ready?"
Luke nodded. "You were right," he said.
"Thank you. I knew it was important. But we'd better hurry now. It'll be dark before we reach the airfield."
Neither had anything more to say as they returned to the cart and climbed atop it for the return trip. Luke checked it closely for any sign of a tracker or tempering, then raised the vehicle a meter off the ground. "No bumps this trip," he said with a small smile, "but I'd still hold on. What do they call those carrion birds here?"
Nakhons.
"That's what we are, then. A big, ugly nakhon." Luke swung the cart in a wide circle over the hills, enclosing Ealtra, scanning for any other vehicles. He found none, and wondered how the Imperial agents had followed them there. But Luke shook off the thought and sent the cart arrowing toward the southeast and the airfield. Their passage was silent, but for the air tearing past the contours of a vehicle that was never meant to fly. Not long after, back in the ruins of the village of Ealtra, the bodies of 2 dead Imperial agents merged with the shadows that had enveloped them, and vanished as though they had never been.